You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Doctor. Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, Star Trek The Next Generation podcast, hosted by me, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward. We're recording this for the benefit of my son, Ben, but we know there's so many great Star Trek fans out there, we're releasing all of these for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm fine, Jay. What about you?
I'm doing very well. It's already been an interesting night, as you've seen. We had an early visit from Ben, who
Yes.
is the focus of this show and the point of it all. But other than that, I think things are doing well. I think tonight's episode is going to be an interesting one because we're reviewing Star Trek: The Next Generation, Season 3, Episode 18, Allegiance. And, on one hand, I think when we were first talking about this episode, you mentioned to me that you really didn't have any notes until you went back and watched it a second time.
Right.
And I have to say, I've watched it 3 times now in preparation for this podcast tonight, and I still don't know how I necessarily feel about the episode. Um, it's good in certain aspects. It's just very strange in others. But I think it will figure something out as we dig into it. Do you have any thoughts that you want to share, though, before we
Yeah,
get started?
I think that it's again what we've seen in season 3 that the stories are much tighter,
Mm-hmm.
and this is where again it's very very tight. Um, there's two storylines to it. Is the these aliens? I don't think we have a name or anything like that. They're doing this study,
No, we don't.
and they take a copy of Picard, and one of them actually becomes his substitute. So you've got the story of, and you'll get in this a little bit more perhaps, of the fake Picard on the Enterprise and doing out of out of the ordinary things. And
Mm-hmm.
then you've got the real Picard in this cell, in this uh, rat maze almost in a sense. And so those are the two counterpart, the two parts
Mm-hmm.
of the story.
So I think that sums it up very well, and I think it also speaks to a recurring theme that we are going to touch on tonight. Um, when we talk about things like familiarity, what does that actually mean in terms of how we apply it in terms of our actual existence? I think a lot of this episode hinges on, first, some great performances by Patrick Stewart. He is able to turn around and do a lot of different things, from singing to, what does that say?
A little clicking still. I don't know what
Oh,
it is.
clicking?
Yeah.
Huh. Um, Sorry, folks. We're trying to figure out what's going on. There's like a clicking on either my side or Dad's side, and here, let me. That did it go away there?
It's not happening now. Yeah.
Okay, let's keep watching it because what I did was basically lift my microphone off my platform that I'm recording this on.
Mm-hmm.
So if need be, I might move the mic someplace else in the
Okay.
middle of the show, which means we might have to pause, folks, but it'll be fine. It'll take a few
Right.
seconds. So let's keep going until we hear the clicking again, or if you hear it, because I can't really hear it on my end. But
Yes. Okay.
um, so I think one thing that this episode explores is the issues of trust and familiarity, and also kind of pushing people I think pushing people to, I guess, the bounds of what is subtly acceptable behavior, because I think we live in this kind of world, and especially with storytelling, where we kind of expect people when they act out in strange ways to act in these very exaggerated big ways. But the truth is, like, the things that really make us notice each other when something's wrong are really small, subtle things. And I think we'll get into that a little bit, um, because I think the episode tries to haphazardly mix the two, like big, weird actions from Picard, but also small, subtle things. But let's dig into the episode real quick and just get
Mhm.
everyone up to speed. So the episode, here, opening a window I shouldn't. So the episode debuted on March 26, 1990, with a star date of 43714.1 in the year 2366.
Mhm.
So the crew of the Enterprise it has recently successfully dealt with a medical mission to treat a plague on Corcorali 5. I think it's later deemed the Fyrox Plague. And we open with Captain Picard sitting in a comfortable chair and reading in his quarters. As he falls asleep, he is scanned by a mysterious probe that seems to be kind of like this flat, sky blue, marvelous sheet, and is transported away into the unknown room, or this rat maze, as you put it earlier, Dad, um, where he cannot communicate with anyone in the USS Enterprise D. On the bridge, an unknown energy source is detected by Data in the captain's quarters. When the captain doesn't answer his page, Lieutenant Worf is immediately sent to investigate, but when they open the doors to Jean-Luc Picard's quarters, they find a doppelganger standing there with a book and a glass of sherry in hand, which to me was the first thing that kind of set off something was
Mhm.
wrong.
Mhm.
And we open the episode from there on. So we've already kind of set up that there's a doppelganger on
And
the
and
USS Enterprise D.
and
Sorry, go on.
and one point when Worf goes to investigate what the energy source could have been at Picard's cabin, they don't realize that he is not the real
Right.
Picard. That's a key point.
Yes. Um, he has been copied, in fact, in
Mm-hmm.
some way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we'll actually get into the copy because when they discuss it later on, like how they actually made the copies of these clones, it actually reveals, I think, a plot hole in the story. But we'll get
Mm-hmm.
there.
Mm-hmm.
So when the actual Jean-Luc Picard wakes up, he is in a black holding cell with lights and two others: Bettina Harrow, a Bolian Starfleet cadet, and Kovatal, or yeah, Kovatal, an
Mr. Thal.
intelligent
Yeah.
Mr. Thal, yeah.
Or Thol.
Um,
Yeah.
Thol, yeah, I kept.
Tholl. Yeah.
Yeah, I know, but how do you pronounce it? Thol, Thal?
I would say Thol. I would say
Yeah,
Thol. Yeah.
we'll go with Thol.
Okay.
But an intelligent Miserian from the planet Mizar 2. Um, So they reveal that the captain. So they reveal that both of these prisoners. I think Thal has been there for 12 days, and Cadet Haru has been there for 3, and they have been sequestered in this chamber for this prolonged period of time, and are being fed these very strange kind of like hard gelatin discs that are
Yeah.
being fed to them from this dispensary in the center.
Right.
And they start slowly exploring just like who they are and what they're doing. And Haru was studying, I think, probably in San Francisco at Starfleet Academy, though they're never really clear about where. I'd have to imagine at this point Starfleet Academy probably has multiple campuses across the galaxy. um, but anyway, and then I think Mr. Thal was in meditation on Mizar too when he was abducted 12
Mm-hmm.
days ago. So they are quickly joined by a um, fourth participant, Esok, a a Chalnoth from I forget what the name of his world was. Let me. I have the reference right
I think it
here.
was I think it was Chalna. Yeah, and he's a Chalnath, something like that. Yeah.
Yes, he's a yeah. It is called Chalna.
Mhm.
Yes, you're correct.
And he
So
was kind of confusing because at first I thought he was a who was the one that Picard, when he was at the academy, got into the fight with and got stabbed in the
right.
heart. They looked
I
like
thought the exact same
the
things.
the
They
and what are they? No, Nosferians or Nausicaans? They looked like a
Nausicaans.
Nausicaan. He looked
Yeah,
like a
he does
Nausicaan.
look like a Nausicaan.
Yeah,
You're very right. Even when he pulled the knife, I kept thinking
yeah, yeah.
Nausicaans. The interesting thing about this, one of the early tip-offs I thought about on the third viewing, because I think by the time you start watching this episode the third time, you're Picard trying to put together the clues that would set things off for you. And one thing that immediately kind of like was a dead giveaway for me as a writer was that when Picard deals with Esok the first time, he reveals that like I went to your planet as a member, as the captain of the Stargazer. Haro knows who Picard is because they're quote unquote studying his missions at the Academy, which I think is actually quite interesting in
Hmm.
terms of what the world building means around Jean Luc Picard at this point.
Yeah, right.
And we can touch on that for a second. Um, and I actually wanted to talk to you about someone related to Picard in the real world. Um, but then we also discover that Picard has some passing understanding of the Miserians and their history because the Miserians, we will come to find out, are a species of quote unquote collaborators. But what the collaboration usually boils down to is someone invades their planet. The Miserians basically bend over, and I think survive by becoming some sort of subservient class to whoever takes them over, which is an interesting thing. And of course, Esok comes from Chalna, which is a planet of quote unquote anarchists, which is something I want to touch on too. But one thing I wanted to touch on in this scenario, especially with Cadet Haro, is she identifies Jean Luc Picard immediately and says, "We study your missions at the Academy." Now, you grew up in a generation where you actually had heroes from World War II that actually played big roles in society, and there was someone I was reading about today, George C. Marshall, and I was wondering if you could talk for a little bit about George C. Marshall for a moment, because the more I read about him, the more I'm discovering that, even during World War II and after, he was this kind of semi legendary figure among the military. And it seemed, and I want to relate this to Picard, because, Picard clearly had a very storied career on the Stargazer, and that's where he came up with the Picard maneuver. So it's very clear that one of the missions they're probably studying at the Academy involving Picard is the Stargate offensive, where he had to figure out how to jump to warp between two
Hmm.
places and
Hmm.
cause a illusion. Um, but can you talk for a moment about George C. Marshall and just kind of growing up in a society where people have these kind of real world legendary figures that
He
people can identify and know about?
George
But you
C.
also had
Marshall.
like Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong and
Well, just to talk about Marshall, he was a senior general. I'm not sure what rank he had to be in World War II. He may have been 4 star. He was one of the few generals like Eisenhower and MacArthur that were 5 star, and George Washington was equivalent of a 5 star. And I think, like many of the officers, senior officers, senior general officers that served in World War II, they all had some experience in World War One to some degree.
Mhm.
Eisenhower didn't. I don't remember whether Marshall did or not, but he,
Marshall did.
but
From my
he,
reading, he did.
he wanted to be a combat commander, but he was thought by Roosevelt to be such a solid individual an advisor to him. He wanted to keep him in Washington. And since there were really only two branches to the military then, the Army and the Navy, they didn't have a
Mm-hmm.
joint chiefs of staff. So I think you had Admiral Ernest King was the chief of the Navy, and George Marshall was the chief of the Army, which of course included
Wasn't
the
Roosevelt at one point Secretary of the Navy?
yes, or an assistant secretary, something like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
and yeah, Roosevelt had a real penchant and kind of loyalty, fondness to the Navy because of that. But Marshall was such a good administrator and wise counsel and a good general from the strategic standpoint. Roosevelt felt that his value was more with him in Washington, so he never went into combat per se. But Eisenhower reported to him. MacArthur had to report to him to some degree. MacArthur was so far away, he could do whatever the hell he wanted to do, basically. The key thing about George Marshall was that after World War II, he was so well respected and so well rounded and a good diplomat. He became the Secretary of State under Truman. And he was the one responsible for putting together
Mm-hmm.
the Marshall Plan that the Europeans still need to remember that it saved them from communism. And it was something that, we wanted to put up a barrier to Soviet expansion into, the political void in Western Europe. But it also, helped them quickly get back on their feet economically. I mean, that's one thing
Mm-hmm.
the U.S. did to all of our enemies, not so much Italy, perhaps, but well, I think Italy benefited from the Marshall Plan, but we were very magnanimous in not treating our former enemies as enemies and helping them rebuild. There were political reasons, of course, because of the Cold War. And
Yeah.
just as an aside, I think what MacArthur did, the book that William Manchester
Mm-hmm.
wrote, American Caesar, that was really amazing. MacArthur's administration in Japan to get them back on their
Yes.
feet.
Well, even though I started this wanting to talk about uh, I'm sorry, I can't, I just blanked on his name, George C.
Marshall,
Marshall.
yeah,
Well, like it's also important to remember that the Marshall Plan actually earned General Marshall the Nobel Peace Prize because it really did have this transformative effect across Europe.
it did.
And like you said,
Yes,
it not only stopped communism, but it really did restore their economy in a way that didn't happen after World War One. In many ways, and you're right to point out too. I hope our European listeners hear this respectfully, of course, when we say this, but you know, one of the things that I think the Americans did that Europeans kind of failed to do was actually learn the lessons of World War One, because we were able to somewhat learn it from afar. We were kind of the last um, in terms of that the Great War. We were in for a good bit for World War Two, definitely. But um, jumping to MacArthur, MacArthur is, not to diminish Marshall in any way, because the Marshall Plan is a really important achievement, but American and European culture was at the time syncretic enough or synchronistic enough that you could reach across a bunch of cultural barriers with the Europeans and quickly get things moving. There were huge cultural barriers in Japan that MacArthur really had to navigate, especially when it came to the abdication and fate of Hirohito, um, really reestablishing a Japanese identity, handling that in a way that you could one hand build up their culture in a prideful manner while at the same time westernizing them, but not giving them the idea in their head to combat Americans. Um, because one thing that MacArthur brought that a lot of people don't know about, he brought over baseball, which became a huge sport in Japan, and he brought over pro wrestling. A lot of
mm,
people don't know this either. he hired a lot of pro wrestlers to come over to Japan and work matches over there, and that really started a huge culture there that is a huge part of Japanese pop culture still to this day.
Mhm.
So like MacArthur really is a genius on multiple levels in terms of being able to negotiate diplomatically immediately after having to pivot from one of the most brutal naval battles in world history.
Well, I mean, you're bringing up the cultural issue because one of the notes I made is um, there was an episode, um, Sins of the Father, that gave us
Yes.
a better understanding of Klingon culture. But this episode also explored differences between cultures. You've outlined some of them where Isak is an anarchist. They have no government, they have no laws per
Hmm.
se. Um, the Mazarian is, very passive, and
Hmm.
and um, and then you could also look at the culture of the beings that have incarcerated these group as they're
Yes.
running this experiment. And matter of fact, there's a cultural lesson that Picard gives to these aliens at the very end.
So let's just get there because I think we're dealing with what's happening in the cell
Mm-hmm.
versus what's happening on the Enterprise D, and those are two.
Oh, one quick
Yeah.
comment about the cell that the food issue had to come up because of Isak, because he's a
Yes.
meat eater and he couldn't eat that, and he was going to starve, so he's going to have to eat somebody after 3 days, which put a lot of pressure on them. But where was their source of water, and where was their latrine?
Oh, that was a great question. I was thinking about that too a few times during the second watching of the episode. Like, one thing I also wondered, like, okay, these people are sleeping under these lights, and there's no clear indication that like they're comfortable doing this. So, like, how much sleep are they actually getting? One question that you asked in your notes: would the captives all be as calm as they were if this was a real captive situation? And I would have to say, like, because of the conceit of the story, of course they would be. But in the real world, I think if someone like Isak was suddenly beamed into a room with three strangers and he has the knife, I think one of us is dead in the next moment. And it's
If not
probably,
everybody, if not
yes, if not everybody.
yeah.
Just so he can not only be safe but have something to eat. Um, I think I think the interesting thing about this experiment, and it gets into the aliens, which, Memory Alpha doesn't actually give them a designation either. The writers never actually gave them a name. Um, these aliens have no concept of moral or ethical boundaries, which um, gets into something I wanted to talk about in terms of the philosophy of science, which is something I think that you could speak on very well. Um, with with a lack of moral and ethical boundaries, these aliens have mysteriously set out to kidnap people from certain societies, force them into this quote unquote rat maze, and then watch to see what their reactions are with no regard to their safety, and as we mentioned, any moral or ethical boundaries, um,
Psychological health.
psychological health. And I think this is where the main confusion of the episode gets to me. On one hand, like these are clearly um, villainous alien characters for the episode, but the the lack of the lack of morals and ethics kind of confused me because there was this understanding of not going too far in certain areas when it came to Card's doppelganger, because Picard's doppelganger had some sense of limits. Like he could have gone all the way with Beverly, or he could have acted really strange in certain ways. Like he knew that there was kind of like lines that he couldn't cross, and he slowly moved the goalpost in terms of like what would the amount of chaos he was allowing until William Riker has to step in and be like, we're not. going to this pulsar in the Lorna system.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the Lorna system.
I think that was
Um,
it.
the Lanka cluster.
Mm-hmm. Lanka.
Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
Paul, the
Yeah.
Lanka cluster. Yeah, because they're
Right.
supposed to meet with the USS Hood to
Right.
assist in terraforming Browder 4,
Mm-hmm.
but Doppelganger Picard diverts them to the Lanka cluster, which is this pulsar that emits this high level of radiation.
Well, based upon what you just said, I think whenever the copying process, you wanted to talk about this,
Yes,
whenever the copying, whenever whatever copy of Picard was put onto one of the aliens,
right.
there were a lot they didn't pick up in terms of what were the social norms and what was Picard's style of interaction as the
Mm-hmm.
captain. So they kind of made it up, and they did okay, but you know, like you sort of said, they kept getting worse and worse and worse, and to the point that he was going to um, get the Enterprise so close to the pulsar that it would be everybody, the ship would be structurally destroyed and everybody killed. That's when Riker, you said stop, and that brings up something we might want to talk about. It brings up, okay, if you're a commanding officer on a ship,
Mm-hmm.
and we've compared Enterprise to a naval vessel on the high seas,
Mm-hmm.
how far can a commanding officer go out of the ordinary to the point that the executive officer takes over or there's a mutiny in some sort? And we don't need
Ooh.
to get into it, but you got a lot of stories like the Kane mutiny, Mutiny on the Bounty. Good movie about that is
Mm-hmm.
Crimson Tide. Very
Oh
good
yeah,
movie with Gene Hackman and Denzel Washington.
great film. Even to a certain extent, Hunt for Red October.
Hmm.
Um, I think the question of mutiny is a tough one, and I actually deal with it in a book that I released not too long ago, The Curse of Shallow Bay,
Hmm.
which is the first book in my Salt Song series, which is a sword
Hmm.
and sorcery series. Bye, bye, bye. Anyway, um, one thing that is central to that story is the burgeoning mutiny between Captain Nagala and his son Tossi, who is the
Hmm.
commander of his
Hmm.
raiders
Hmm.
on the ship. And one thing that like Tossi argues with his father about is like, okay, in the story they're surrounded by monsters. They think they're being hunted by a siren and this thing called an Alma, which is kind of this lobster monster, folks. Just bear with me. Um, but they're stuck in the middle of this bay, and their food has been spoiled by salt water. Their fresh water is running out, and there are people who have been killed, and one of their family members is grievously wounded, like terribly wounded. And I think when things like panic and the potential loss of every life sets in, I think people start measuring things differently. I think when it comes to Riker, um, he has an understanding that when Jean Luc Picard is not capable, he is captain. And I think this is the good part of like maybe the military hierarchy of rank is that everyone is supposed to, at some level, understand their roles.
Hmm.
And the primary role of the captain on a Federation Starfleet is to protect the well being of the crew. And I think the moment Picard deviates from that in any way, there is an argument for a mutiny. Because they have that meeting, I think, in Riker's quarters beforehand,
Yeah.
where they talk about, like, okay, he's acting really weird. Like, what do we do to replace him? Wants to keep going to this pulsar.
It's a very responsible conversation they have because they all
Yes.
agree from his plight toying with Beverly, and the buying ales for everyone and singing intent forward and so forth.
Which, where we get some of our intro song
Yeah, yeah,
by
and
Pogo.
he's not doing anything that's harmful to the ship. He's diverting them from what their assigned mission is to meet the hood.
Right.
But but again, it's not. He's the captain. They have to follow orders. There are this military culture. But I think the conversation of the senior officers with Riker is that basically what they're saying is if he's getting close to crossing the red line, and
Yes.
and he does, and then Riker says no, belay that order, and Picard, the fake Picard, tells Worf to arrest, Riker, and um,
Worf resists.
Worf resists, and I think Wesley Crusher resists also.
Yeah. Well, one thing that's interesting about this storyline is that it sets up a really simplistic um, dichotomy or a really simplistic binary. It's either disobey the captain or die. So like that's a very
Mm,
easy thing to mutiny about. Like everyone's
sure.
kind of justified because Data's sitting there saying like, "Hey captain, if we don't move from this place in 15 minutes, the ship's going to be destroyed." And then he says, "Go closer," and everyone's like, "Excuse me, go closer." No, sir. Um, I think versus like Crimson Tide. I think you mentioned that one. That correct me if I'm getting the storyline wrong, but in that story, they are given orders to launch their nuclear arsenal on the boat. And what happens is that Gene Hackman's character agrees to do it, but um, Denzel Washington's character, who plays as XO, forms a mutiny. Is that
Well,
a
what
correct
happened was
reading of the
that
story?
Gene Hackman is very aggressive commander of this nuclear
Right.
ballistic missile submarine, and some of the
They
discussion
may or may not be given an order to launch.
they get a garbled order,
Right.
and that's where the controversy goes. Where um, Denzel Washington believes that I think there's sort of a two decision that the XO has to decide to launch the missiles, and the XO in terms of played by Denzel Washington, he doesn't agree because it's like the message is garbled. We don't know what it's really saying. We have to realize that, as the captain says, the hell with it, we're going to shoot the missiles at these bad Russians in eastern part of Russia. And the XO is saying, well, wait a minute, since we don't have clear orders, we don't know what the situation is. We need to hold back, otherwise we are going to cause catastrophe for the whole world, and
See that.
that's where the whole mutiny situation is set up. You immediately have um, the crew, particularly the other officers, um, form either they support the
Hmm.
captain and they support the XO, and it kind of gets crazy because they have enough weapons on the ship that they start running around with pistols and M16s
Yeah.
on board the sub.
Well, it it comes down to this really dire question of do we kill people or do we let them live? And people take sides over that issue in Crimson Tide in a very interesting way. Um, One thing that I found, and you were describing Crimson Tide, and I think another movie that's kind of in a similar vein, though it's more action and sci-fi oriented. Do you remember The Rock with Sean Connery, Nicolas Cage,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
Ed? Oh my God, what's that actor's name? He was in
Ed Harris.
Ed Harris.
Yeah,
Great actor.
yeah,
Um, there's that scene where they have to make the decision to launch the nerve gas rocket.
right.
And at the very last minute, the general decides, I'm not doing this. I'm not going to kill all these people in San Francisco to make my
He's
point.
he sends it out to sea. Yeah,
Right. And then he has to face off against the mercenaries who are like, no, look, we betrayed our country. We've gone this far. Like, at this point, like, you have to pull the trigger, sir.
right.
And I think it gets into a very interesting and complicated discussion of like, okay, if you go far enough, is there a point you can actually turn back? um I think this
Mm.
episode is just very simplistic in terms of how it sets up the dichotomy between Riker and the crew versus the captain. it's just it's not a very hard challenge for them to
No,
surmount.
I think you get into the idea of concept of the psychological point of no return.
Hmm.
And when you're talking about what you said just in the movie The Rock with Ed Harris and Nicolas Cage and Sean Connery, um, that psychological point of return for Ed Harris, his character, was very fuzzy.
Hmm.
Had real difficulty with it. Um, the two
And
protagonists,
isn't
and
even a really a villainous character.
no, well, he
If
is and
you
he is.
understand his,
Yeah,
yeah.
yes,
Well,
exactly.
he takes hostages, but he doesn't kill the
Right,
hostages.
right.
Like he's making a point of all the U.S. POWs that were
I
left
mean, the bad
behind.
thing is that when they send the SEAL team in, they all get killed. You know,
Yes,
remember.
terrible.
But the in Crimson Tide, there's not there's not a psychological point of no return because everything is so fuzzy because they've got
Right.
this they don't have clear orders. They don't have a clear complete message. Matter of fact, there's a part in Crimson Tide where Vosler, who's the radio operator, Denzel
Hmm.
Washington says to him, "You need to be like Scotty on Star Trek and figure out how to make this radio work."
Right. Uh,
But but then you know but get on to this episode, Allegiance. There's no psychological point of return. You know, clear
yeah.
thing. Um,
Well, another one that and it's funny that we're talking about submarine movies. One I think kind of conflict surround center around mutiny that works really well from a narrative perspective is Hunt for Red October. Because, on one hand, you have this entire crew of, in their mind, loyal, patriotic Russians who are following this patriot. We talk about Jean-Luc Picard being legendary. In Tom
oh yeah.
Clancy's world, Ramius is considered this legendary submarine captain.
The Vilnius nastavnik, this
Yeah.
Vilnius school teacher, right? And
Um,
actually, the point of psychological point of return that happens early on in the movie
right.
when Ramius has to kill the political officer, the KGB
Right.
political officer,
But
and
during
of
that,
course, actually, and even before that, he did it when he sent the letter to Admiral Padorin.
yes. But the important thing about that film is that throughout that story, the crew themselves have to make a
Yes,
decision whether or not they're going to
yes.
keep following Ramius, especially when like
After
they
the Russian Soviet bomber drops a torpedo on them. Yes.
exactly. And
Yeah.
I think that movie handles that tension very well, especially
Hmm.
when Jack Ryan finally gets aboard the submarine and they're like, wait, we're going to start talking with the goddamn CIA now? Like, do we really
Hmm.
want to go through with this?
Hmm.
Because there's that one scene where they have to talk about the caterpillar,
Mm.
and they actually might have to show Ryan the caterpillar, and I think that scene's very good because I can't remember the engineer's name or the actor who played him, but he's great.
Hmm.
But he has this moment where he's like, "Are we really showing this guy this piece of technology? Like, are we going to trust him?" And Raimi's like, "Yeah, show him." And it's this. I think it's this very good. I think it's this very good event where it just shows like you have to make very difficult decisions based on your values in the given moment. And when it comes
Hmm.
to really difficult things that could have world rending consequences or life and death consequences, there really is no easy decision. Um, even though I'm criticizing this episode for the simplistic setup of like, it's the crew versus the captain in terms of whether the ship stays apart in this radiation or not, they still have to like risk a lot of things to kind of take down like an earned authority figure. Like Jean-Luc Picard isn't just a normal captain. He's someone who is truly the heart and soul of the ship.
And the point you bring up is sort of that in addition to the experiment the aliens were carrying out in the rat maze, the prison cell, whatever you want to call it.
Hmm.
And one of the questions it leads to is that did they really learn anything from this? The other experiment they were doing actually was by having this fake Picard who was, you know, behaving in an aberrant fashion. Did the aliens who observed, because they're telepathic and so forth, did they learn anything from what we're talking about, how the crew remained loyal to their commanding officer until that red line was crossed?
I Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I don't think they actually learn anything at all until Picard captures them,
I would agree. Yeah,
because they don't have any outside stimulus responding to the things that they do. One thing that I found kind of troubling about this episode, because it's never addressed again, and it's never addressed again in any episode of Star Trek that I'm aware of. You have this race of beings that's shown to be observing people, capturing people, kidnapping them, and then experimenting with them. And then all of a sudden, they are captured by the flagship crew of the Federation. And this is not treated as a big deal, like, oh, we're just going to drop them off at a starbase. But these people have technology that they were not only able to like beam Captain Picard off the out of his own quarters, but also make it almost exact copy of him that was able to convince them long enough that he was able to make them change course and put themselves in danger or right to the edge of it. There's a lot of risks with these people, and no, I don't think that they learned anything until they had to endure the subjugation of their own methodology. But this gets into another, I think, broader question about the philosophy of science.
mm,
You know, throughout history, science has had, I won't say that the scientific method by itself is a wonderful thing in terms of being able to explore ideas and concepts of the physical world and derive data from them so we can derive facts. And using those facts, we can interpret some sort of truth from them. Um, However, I think both you and I would agree that if we look at history, science has always been affected by ethical and moral um, limits just as much as anything else has. And people will use science to justify terrible things, um, as much as they will use science to purport and push forward good things. For every Stephen Hawking who is helping us figure out um, how event horizons work, or for every who's the person that came up with the polio vaccine? I can't
Salk,
remember his name.
Salk, Jonas Salk. Yeah,
Yeah, Jonas Salk.
and there was right.
For every Jonas Salk who is making the patents to his vaccines publicly available so everyone can be vaccinated, you have you have people that are designing weapons. You have people that are assassinating. You have people like Joseph Mengele, who was doing human experimentation. You have the Chinese government today experimenting on 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps, especially women.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
Science can be used in a lot of terrible and inhumane ways. And I think this episode is a key example of how, when you have a society that has science, but they don't have any ethical or moral bounds, things get really scary really quick. And because it's Star Trek, there's a little bit of lightheartedness to all this. And even in the end, they're like, haha, the captain's back, and we're going to have fun with what he did or what his doppelganger did. We'll have some fun with him about it. But the truth is, like, a lot of really big lines were crossed by this alien race, from not only a scientific perspective, from our view in the real world, but also from a philosophical perspective. And I was just wondering what you thought about the philosophy of science as it applies here, but also, like, where does the application of humanity play a role in it, do you think?
well, I think that some things you mentioned of the inhumane experiments that were performed by the Nazis, by the Japanese, um, ended up. I mean, even there was some Tuskegee. They inoculated
Right.
people, African Americans, with syphilis, so they get neurosyphilis and not treat them to see what the results were. That's
Oh, we
just.
sterilized thousands of African American women in North
Oh yeah,
Carolina.
sure, sure. Happened in a lot of southern states, even northern states. But you know, we've gotten to the point where
Terrible
there
crimes.
there are there are rules about that, and there's rules for when you do clinical trials how you treat human subjects, how far you can go. There's even some Helsinki principles on how you use animals in
Hmm.
experiments. Um, but um, restate your question again.
Where do you think where do you think humanity applies in the philosophy of science? And what do you think the bounds of the philosophy of science are? Do you think there's places that like science
Hmm.
shouldn't touch, or maybe there's some things that certain methodologies that shouldn't be engaged in?
I, I think that you kind of take the medical principle of do no harm. I
Hmm.
think science should actually, since you have to say science is a very human activity and endeavor, and it has to be done for this. It's, as you kind of are leading to or saying, it has to be, the purpose has to be to advance humanity, advance the species, and
Okay.
advance the ecosystem in which we live. I mean, if we didn't have good science, we wouldn't understand how serious the climate changes are. We
Hmm.
wouldn't have any strategies. We'd just be, cooking ourselves and so on. And I think the other thing, when I ask the question, ask you to restate the question, it gets into the whole thing of this, vaccination movement versus
Hmm.
anti-vaxxing versus, individual rights, which I just think is, I understand the individual rights aspect to it. However, I think the science is very clear that
Yes.
when the Delta surge started in the U.S., and you've got very serious Delta surges in some northern states, particularly uh, Michigan and New York. I think it's Upper New York State. That
Yes.
it's all Delta, and most of these people are, um, unvaccinated. And then,
They're
it,
voluntarily choosing to go unvaccinated.
right,
Yes.
and then beyond that, there's concern about this new variant, Omicron,
Oh
and
yeah.
we don't totally understand it. It seems like it's maybe more infectious, easy to transmit, but does not cause as serious as disease. And it's even because it's easier to transmit, it's even causing breakthrough infections that people are vaccinated. But the lesson to be learned here is unless we can get the whole planet, the whole human race vaccinated, we just continue to create the possibility of this virus mutating and coming up with something that's worse than Delta, worse than Omicron. And I think this is where, there's some of this anti vax stuff is almost, it, the whole rights issue blurs the fact that there's a certain non science disrespect for science to it.
I think that I think I do not want to play devil's advocate.
You
Mm,
can.
I don't want. Well, I don't want to play it too deeply because I agree with you on all of these points. And before we go further, just for people listening in the future, I'm in full support of people being vaccinated. Um,
Same here.
I am, however, and this is where I think you and I may differ, and me and the audience may differ. I am not necessarily in support of mandates, just because there have been um, mandates done historically where communities of marginalized communities have suffered and not been taken care of properly in terms of medical no, this is something that
No, no,
they
no. Go ahead.
report themselves. And I think this gets into the question of, the philosophy of science, but also medical ethics. Um, I think that people should be given a choice about what they put in their bodies. At the same time, I think that they should be willing to understand that if they make a choice to not be vaccinated, they have to deal with the consequences of potentially not being able to go into businesses, not being able to be allowed into restaurants, having certain rights and privileges curtailed because other people make decisions to protect themselves and their families. Um, I think the question of a mandate really does get into a question of like civil liberties, and I think a mandate is. And before I finish,
Go ahead.
while I'm not for mandates, if you can go to a court, if you can go to a reasonable, functional Supreme Court, which you and I can get into a debate whether or not we have that now, but if you were able to go to court and legally make the argument that a mandate would not only help society, but help us in this pandemic, I would support you. But you have to make the argument. You just can't point blank say everyone has to do this, or else you're going to
Well,
just you're going to feed a resistance.
to put the whole mandate and resistance to mandates into perspective, when the polio vaccine came out in the 60s, that was such a devastating disease. I don't think there was a mandate. Everybody was like, thank God that this has been developed. And,
But
I don't know what the percentage was, but, there was, of course, we didn't have the social media and the news hose information that we have now, but I can't remember anybody saying, I'm not going to get vaccinated. When they took my third grade class down to the nurse's office, I don't remember any parent showing up and said, "You're not going to give that
well,
sugar
Dad,
cube to my
Dad,
child."
do you know where it was? Do you know where it was? Like those kids were ending up in wheelchairs or dying
Or no, they were
but
in iron lungs. Yeah.
or iron lungs. But let me finish. The point I'm trying to make here is that people saw the cost of polio every day in the survivors. So when a vaccine came along, I I can totally understand why a society of people who have been suffering for this for generations go like, you mean my kid doesn't have to suffer this, the next generation, and their next generation doesn't have to suffer this? Of course, everyone would do that. I think one of the things that we have failed to do, and the media failed to do this with COVID, and this is going to sound really kind of um, callous on my end, and this gets into the philosophy of science and medical ethics too. And maybe what I'm suggesting shouldn't be done, but I think that you should have showed people dying in hospital beds of COVID, like actually show them what it looks like.
Well, I think
Like
you saw you
we
saw.
haven't. I've never seen anyone die of COVID in a hospital bed, but I have seen people die of polio on YouTube.
Well, we're approaching 800,000 Americans that have died,
Right,
and there's probably good evidence that it's much higher than that.
right.
I mean,
But it doesn't
for
feel
instance,
like that because I don't think we see it.
right. The other interesting thing, I mean, you could, talking of freedom of choice. I mean, it's
Hmm.
obvious back in the 70s that smoking was bad for you. It can
Yes.
increase the risk of heart disease and cancer.
Hmm.
And there's not been a mandate to stop smoking. There's been pushes, there's been strong
No.
suggestion, there's been showed people with bad lungs and people totally debilitated and dying young. The interesting thing of a new way to deal with that, New Zealand is going to, I just heard in the news the other day, they're going to slowly increase the age of who can even buy cigarettes with the goal they're going to totally outlaw smoking. So that is, now whether tobacco will become, an underground illegal thing like weed or
Yeah.
something, I don't know. It's
Oh, it
very,
totally will.
but it's very interesting that a government is taking that step. It's not a mandate, but they're really putting pressure on people to not smoke.
Well, let's call that what that is for a second. That's social engineering.
It is. Yeah.
Like, it's the gradual social engineering of New Zealand society. And, like, the truth is, it's kind of like, sticking with COVID, uh, God, what is it where you do viral research? Um, it's what they were doing at Wuhan, but we also do it at the CDC. What's the term for it? You need to help me.
I
Um, it's where we it's where we create stronger viruses so we can create stronger
right.
cures.
Right.
That's the term I'm looking for.
We
But
yeah, we genetically manipulate them, their genome.
well, like, that is something that I think, kind of getting to your last point, also falls into the difficult aspect of, like, social engineering that we're talking about here, which, I think the philosophy of science deals with as well as medical ethics. We are developing these mRNA vaccines that will hopefully help us deal with a lot of ailments across the globe. Um, in some ways, these are helping us socially engineer a better society going forward. Social engineering is not bad. So when every time I hear a conspiracy theorist saying, like, "Oh, these social engineers are trying to do this to us," it's like, well, yeah, every government takes part in social engineering. Every organization takes part in some form of social engineering. I think the big question that we have going forward when it comes to COVID or things like smoking, I I think that we are at the point in society that, and this is gonna take a tangent, folks. So pardon me. Um, I think representational democracy is failing. I don't think democracy is failing. I think people like the idea of one person, one vote, and being able to see representational change in their government and actually see policies enacted that affect their, again, social engineering. I think we all like the idea that we can all take part in that engineering together. Um, I think the problem now is that you have a large portion of people that live one way, and then you have governments that make decisions that don't fit the way most people live anymore. For example, I know a lot of people here in New York that have stopped smoking just because of health reasons, but also because, cigarettes are taxed higher here, so it's
It's
very expensive to
expensive.
smoke.
Sure.
But there's never going to be this idea that you're going to actually outlaw it, or you're actually going to make cigarettes illegal, because that ended up in, God, I think I want to make sure I get his name
Oh,
correct.
it's sort of like the genie's out of the box. You're not going to put him back in.
Well, so, well, it's not that the genie's out of the box. It leads to, like, really dangerous situations, and it leads to shadow economies that put a lot of people at risk. Primarily, I don't remember if you remember the killing of Eric Garner here in New York,
Hmm.
but he was selling loose cigarettes. He was
Hmm.
illegally selling cigarettes
Hmm.
on the quote unquote black market, because
Hmm.
people do that. So I think if you make anything illegal today, there is automatically going to be, pushback against it, because people don't want their civil liberties entailed. It's like trying to push prohibition today. Do you think anyone's really going to push the idea of banning alcohol? Like, is New Zealand going to ban alcohol too when they ban cigarettes? Like, it's kind of a silly notion.
Right.
I think you see where I'm getting to.
Excuse me. Yes.
Um, and I think, and this gets back to vaccine mandates. Vaccine mandates are not silly notions. They're very important, and I think there's something that needs to be heavily considered. But when you have things in history like prohibition or cigarette bans or any form of government trying to exert some sort of force on people's social behavior, I think you're just automatically going to have a pushback to that. And I think, especially now with our political division and
Hmm.
with the way our media feeds it,
Hmm.
I think you can't have a rational conversation about a vaccine mandate, because there's no rational people to have a conversation with
Hmm.
at the level that we need to have the discussion at, which
Hmm.
is in the media. Like, you and I have talked previously about, And philosophy of science again. Um, I am not a supporter of people taking ivermectin to treat COVID-19, but the truth about the history of ivermectin is that is not as easy as saying, oh, it's a horse dewormer. Like, it is an actual antiviral and antifungal treatment that gained a Nobel Peace Prize for helping people in the third world, but it's not an effective COVID-19 treatment.
Right.
However, because we didn't have the proper framing of that, we now have this controversy around it that we shouldn't be having.
Well,
And,
that's
and
that's that's the whole problem
well,
with all the.
philosophy of science requires you have to have that framing. It's a moral and ethical imperative to make these framings clear.
Kind of maybe to end this conversation, get back to the episode. It's that the political divisiveness, the disinformation, the using, different opinions as political tools for different parties, it just dilutes down the science, and um,
Well,
has made things a lot worse.
it gets to a point that I know it feels like we've gotten away from the episode, but this is getting us back to it. You bring a point up in your notes. Is the distrust that the captives demonstrate under stress an allegory for our current political and social situation
Mm-hmm.
that does not allow us as a society to cogently address the huge problems we are currently facing domestically and globally? Um, I think in some ways we are in that controlled situation, that we are in that rat maze, and that we aren't being able to have a realistic conversation because we don't see a doorway out. And I don't think we're being observed, and I do think we're being manipulated, and we are being observed. But I think without making this sound too conspiratorial, I think that there's always going to be an inherent level of stress to our existence. I think the stress that we feel now, and I wonder if you would agree with this. I think the existential stress that we're feeling now is wholly different from anything else that humans have experienced
Oh,
before, and maybe it's technology that plays a part in that. But I also think it's how we are using this technology to communicate with each other.
I think there might have been times in the past where people felt existentially threatened, but not in the same way that we're existentially threatened now, because it's from political division, it's from a pandemic, it's from climate change. I mean,
Hmm.
it's really a lot of big stuff, all happening at once.
And in many ways, I think when disasters happen with this potential mutiny that Riker has to install, the tension is really what drives things mad.
Hmm.
But the question is, like, when you get to this situation, okay, when the Picard doppelganger orders orders Wesley Crusher to move the ship closer to the pulsar, and Riker tells him to belay that order. I'm not going to ask you what Riker would do. I'm going to ask you if you were Worf and Picard told you to arrest Riker and take him off the bridge. What are you doing?
I, since I'm part of the bridge crew, the senior officer group of the Enterprise, I would do what Worf had done.
Yeah, but why? Do you do it because of your own basic survival? Do you do it out of loyalty to Riker? Do you do it out of like concern of the recognition of the situation?
I think recognition of the situation first, which
Right.
leads into supporting the decision or the action that the executive officer, the second in command, is taken, and it does get into a self-preservation or a preservation of the entire crew, the entire ship.
Well, I think it makes a really important point in this episode about the value of discipline in a hierarchy. And when someone
Hmm.
starts losing discipline in the hierarchy, like it really does cast things into doubt.
Hmm.
Picard starts doing things like he shows up to a poker game, which he never does before, and he observes, but then he asks this weird question of Troy about, if I really put the crew in danger, would they be loyal to me? And she's like, yes, of course, we
Mm-hmm.
trust you.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, oh, okay. And then later on, he has this very awkward date with Beverly, where he basically tries to, I guess, explore their feelings in a kind of ham-fisted way. But it all slowly leads to, like, there's also this scene in Ten Forward where he shows up and he sings naval drinking songs
Mm-hmm.
and orders ales for the entire bar. But during all of this, you see a slow loosening of Picard's discipline, where the reserve captain who would never fraternize with his crew this way is suddenly fraternizing. And I think it's that loss of discipline among a hierarchy that is usually the first thing that tips us off. Because, and I use the word discipline kind of nebulously. I think when we think of discipline, we kind of think of this rigid commitment to acting and thinking and being a certain way or doing a certain thing. But I think there's also kind of like this subconscious discipline we have in terms of the way we do things every day and the way we act. And I think when we break that discipline, I think that's when we start noticing that things are going wrong. Do you think that I have? Do you agree with this, or do you
I
have your
do.
own view?
No, no, I do. I think you're spot on. Yeah.
So I think that leads to two things I wanted to ask you before we wrap up this episode, because we've been going a bit and it's late. Um, when it comes to an when it comes to an organizational hierarchy, do you think there is a greater value in your experience in the solvency of the hierarchy or in the fiber of the individuals taking part in the hierarchy? Like if you had to choose one or the other, like a stable system of command or decision making, or a lot of great individuals to build a system with, which would you pick?
A balance between both.
No, but I understand it. Everyone
Hmm.
wants a balance between both, but if you had to pick one or the other,
Um, I kind of, I kind of, I kind of choose the individuals first because you have to
right,
have the building blocks of the command structure. You have to have the right building blocks of the command structure.
right. Well, I think the thing about systems today, and I think this is actually a part. Oh, that's what that. I think I figured out what the clicking is.
Hmm.
Um, okay. Um, I think the things that people forget about hierarchies and command structures today, and hierarchies in general, is that they expect that the people that slip into certain roles are able and have the ability to fit those roles at the time that they're needed. But I think the more we see society progress, especially in the 21st century, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Dad, it really seems like we're suffering institutional failures not because the institutions themselves are set up to fail, but the people involved manipulate and twist them in a way that they're ultimately working against their own ends. So it really does become a question of, like, you could have the best system in the world, but if you have shit people, you just have shit.
Yes. Yeah.
Have you found that to be true in, like, your professional career, or is there times where you think like you can have an organization that is like really well put together, even if it's run by shitty people, and it endure and thrive?
I won't go into specific details, but yeah, I think that there is, the sectors that I've been in, eye banking for corneal transplantation, even organ transplantation. I think that there's, you know, it's become too business oriented and
Hmm.
all not for profit organizations, but they're still looking at the bottom line.
Hmm.
Some of these organizations have, you know, reserves far beyond what used to be normal for not profit organizations who most of the revenue has come from a service fee. And how much of it is people just being greedy, and how much of it is just it's a chicken and egg. Is it a cultural thing, or is that you get people just greedy that they move it in this direction so that they don't look upon, what's the mission they really need to achieve.
And I think that comes down to a very interesting viewpoint. And I'll leave it with this, and then we'll end the episode.
Hmm.
I was reading this very interesting debate between two people who helped found Silicon Valley.
Hmm.
And one person's viewpoint is that Silicon Valley had done all these wonderful things and were full of these innovative people like Steve Jobs and Wozniak and blah 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 and all these companies. And the other person was like, yeah, they did all these great things, but if you look at the culture they kind of put forward and the way they treated people and the way the places that we ended up now, like none of this is necessarily healthy because the founders themselves weren't healthy. And like I think one way that someone put this is that, at one point everyone in Silicon Valley was microdosing LSD because they thought it made them better workers.
Mm.
So it becomes a question. Are you a better creative? Are you just a functioning addict? And I think
Mm.
that really does come down to the viewpoint
Hmm.
of, you know, it doesn't matter what the system is, it comes down to the person in the
Mm.
system.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, Before we go, let's clean up some things. You had a question of the sub experiment when how uh, the Picard doppelganger draws out Beverly Crusher's feelings for him and then plays her. Mentions what's the other issue
Oh
when
yes,
it
right.
comes to their feelings besides him being in command. Um, I've always understood that to be unresolved things related to Jack Crusher's death.
That's exactly what I thought. Yes.
Yeah. Um, Other than that, I think and again, this episode is a little wonky for me.
Hmm.
The episode ends on such a weird, humorous high note of everyone being like, "Oh, haha, the captain's doppelganger embarrassed him, and now he's going to hear these stories." And then
Right.
Beverly
Right.
Crusher walking on the bridge like, "Oh, hi, boyfriend."
Yeah.
Um, it's just kind of a weird ending and a weird
Hmm.
note
Hmm.
after we've just been through essentially a prison episode.
Hmm.
um, do you have any final thoughts on this episode before we
No,
or
no. I
do you
think
think we've covered it?
I think we've covered it pretty well. And if people watch the episode and listen to the podcast, they'll find it interesting.
Well, I hope so too.
Yeah.
Dad, thank you so much for joining me. We will be back next time for season 3, episode 19, Captain's Holiday.
Hmm.
So have a good night.
Good night. Thanks, Jay.